Welcome to Chess Dog, where people come to get stronger at chess. My name is John, and today we're asking the question, has the Jobava London system been refuted? Is there a bust to the Jobava London system? Well, let's take a look. Our story begins with Simon Williams, who came up with a chessable course on the Jobava London system. Let's look at our starting position, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4. This is the official start of the Jobava London. And in this position, another player, Grandmaster Sam Shankland, in his program on Chessable, recommends e6. Now, in this line, in Simon Williams' course, he recommended e3. Now, Sam Shankland's program came out after Simon Williams, and in this position, Sam Shankland recommends bishop to b4, with the idea of putting pressure on that c3 knight. The knight on f6 can come into e4 and apply extra pressure to that knight. The line progresses something like this: bishop to d3, c5, pawn takes, knight b to d7, a strong move threatening knight takes c5, knight g to e2, and then a6. Taking away that b5 square, and in this position, black is threatening to play e5, the white bishop goes to g3, and then e4. And that bishop at d3 would be completely trapped. So bishop to g3, then knight to h5, going after the bishop pair. I won't get too far into the weeds in the analysis of this position. Suffice it to say, Sam Shankland makes a very good case that black is doing well here, and it's pretty convincing. So let's go back then. If Simon Williams' e3 is not that strong, what then should white play? Well, the discussion was advanced by none other than Jobava himself, who, after Sam Shankland came out with his line against the Jobava, played this move in a tournament game. He's threatening, obviously, to take knight c7, and of course that would just win the game, forking the king and the rook. So black is forced to respond with a6, knight to a6, covering the c7 square. Then e3, bishop to e7, knight f3, castles. Now this is how the game Jobava Perez, which was played on a titled Tuesday Blitz, progressed up until this point. Now, Sam Shankland covers this position, and he only shows white playing bishop to e2. But Jobava, in this position, chooses h3. He wants to preserve that strong bishop at f4, and now if the knight goes to h5, that bishop can go right to h2, tuck itself away, and stay on that strong diagonal. c6, knight c3, c5. This is how the game with Jobava progressed. Jobava plays a3 to keep pieces out of the b4 square. Bishop to d6. His opponent wants to trade off those dark squared bishops. Jobava says, no, I'm going to keep him on the board. Plays bishop to g5, pins the f6 knight to the queen. Now, this knight at a6 is offside, so Perez needs to centralize it, so he plays it back to b8 with the idea of coming back to c6. Jobava takes on c5, bishop takes c5, bishop to d3. So now this bishop is aiming at h7 to potentially attack the king, and also supporting the e4 pawn push, which would help liquidate black's center. The knight comes to c6, white castles, h6, bishop h4, and now the bishop retreats to e7. So what we have here, essentially for white, is a Slav structure, the kind of structure black would get if he played the Slav defense. But white has that structure himself. And in a Slav structure, the way you combat your opponent is you play the c-pawn up 2 squares or the e-pawn up 2 squares. The problem in this position is that white's c-pawn is blocked by the knight at c3. So the only way he can attack black's center is to play e4. So Jobava prepares that move with rook to e1. He wants to play the pawn to e4. Black plays b6 so he can develop the bishop on b7. Now here, Jobava goes ahead and plays e4. He probably should have prepared that move with one more preparatory move, such as queen to e2, then after bishop to b7, then e4, knight e4, bishop e7, knight e7, knight e4. And you have a position that is similar to what actually happens in the game. After e4, Jobava's opponent should have played knight takes e4. Then, after a long, complicated line, bishop takes e4, bishop h4, knight d5, pawn takes, queen d5 with a pin and attack on that c6 knight, bishop to b7, knight takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen to d7, attacking the b7 bishop, rook b8, bishop takes c6. And if bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, you just have an equal position. What black can do here is play rook f to d8, and that hits the queen. The queen is forced to go to c7 to stay in defense of the bishop on c6. Queen c4 pins the bishop to the queen. Rook a to d1 hits the rook at d8. Then after rook dc8, queen takes bishop, rook takes bishop, bishop takes in, rook to f8, c3. And you have a very complex endgame where white has rook, bishop, and pawn in exchange for a queen. That is what black should have done. Instead, black plays also a very natural move. Pawn takes pawn, knight e4, bishop to b7, bishop takes bishop, knight, bishop takes bishop, c3. The idea of c3 is to blunt that bishop at f6 and keep it from extending all the way down to b2. Limit that bishop at f6 mobility. Also, it allows his own bishop at d3 to tuck back to c2 later. If bishop to e7, queen to e2, the rook a would go to d1, bishop b1, queen c2, threats along that b1 h7 diagonal. So instead, black plays queen to e7. The queen still goes to e2, rook f to d8, rook a to d1. And now black plays g6. And this weakens his kingside structure, and this is going to be a problem moving forward. Jobava, seeing this, takes advantage of it. First of all, he gets rid of that dark squared bishop. Black has dark squared weaknesses, so you get rid of the dark squared bishop. Queen f6, bishop e4. Now let me explain white's strategy in this position, because it's a very common strategy in the structure that you get in a Jobava London. Essentially, white has a queen-side pawn majority. You see those three highlighted pawns in green on the queen side versus 2 for black. So what white wants to do is advance those 3 pawns against those 2 pawns and create one passed pawn, and then try to get that one passed pawn all the way to the 8th rank so he can queen it. Now, black has the pawn majority on the other side of the board. The problem is those pawns are in front of his king, so if he advances them, his king will be placed under attack. So white is the only one who can really advance and create a passed pawn here. So white has an advantage now because he has a strategy and black really doesn't. Black plays knight to a5 to trade off light squared bishops, but that's a mistake. Jobava plays b4. Which means he's able to advance that queenside pawn majority with tempo by threatening the knight at a5. The knight has to go back. Queen to e3, hitting the pawn at h6. King to g7, defending that pawn. c4, the pawn majority begins to roll. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook to d8, rook takes rook, and knight takes d8, bishop b7, knight to b7. So a bunch of exchanges, both rooks and bishops. And now, looking at the position, what white is going to do, he's going to use his queen and his knight to help advance his pawn majority while also threatening his opponent's king. And by mixing threats back and forth, he's going to be able to put black in a position where he can't defend. He plays knight to e5. Jobava could have probably just gone ahead and played c5 here. Pawn takes, queen to b2, knight e5. The c pawn is running up the board. White threatens knight to g4, hitting h6 with the queen and the knight. So that was also a possibility. He went ahead and played knight to e5 here. Knight to d6, c5. Pawn takes. So now the fruit of that pawn majority has come to bear. He now has his passed pawn. Now he has to find a way to usher that c-pawn up the board. Knight to f5, queen to e4 to get away from the threat of the knight and also to centralize the queen, queen d8, and queen to b7. And now that queen at b7 is perfectly placed to help that c-pawn march to the queening square of c8. The queen goes to e7 and c6. Now, if queen takes queen, the pawn would take the queen and would be unstoppable to the b8 queening square. So black plays king to f6, and this is a critical mistake, because now white can set up a threat of a discovered check against the king with this move. Jobava plays queen to b2. Now he's threatening to remove the knight, revealing a check against the king, and anything that knight happens to threaten, black won't be able to defend because he's got to worry about his king being in check first. And there's no convenient way to get out of this. If he actually tries to play king to g5 to get out of that line of attack, white just plays knight to f3. If the king goes to h5, g4 is mate. If the king goes to f4, queen to e5 is mate. So there's no way to get out of this discovery. Black's in big trouble. He plays queen to c7. The knight goes to d7 with check. The king moves to g5. If the king had moved to e7, then queen to c3, holding on to that c-pawn, and the threat of g4 is simply devastating. It would kick the knight at f5 away, and there's no good square for the knight to move to. They all lead to a very quick loss for black. So he moves instead to g5. Queen f6, king f4. If he goes to h5, g4 is mate. King to f4, queen to c3 with the threat of queen to f3 check, and the king would have to go to g5, then queen to g4 mate. Now, this is in time pressure. This was a blitz game, and Jobava actually misses a few mating patterns here, but I'm sure it was in a time scramble. Black plays e5, and here Jobava could have gone ahead with that. Queen f3, king g5, queen g4 mate. The f6 square is covered by the knight at d7. Instead, he plays g3 check, king to g5, h4 check, king g4. Knight takes pawn check. The knight is defended by the queen at c3, so cannot be captured. King to h3, g4 check, a discovered check via the queen on c3. King h4, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, queen g3 check, king h5, and f4 with a threat of queen to h3 mate. So black plays queen to e7 with the hopes of blocking that attack. But after queen h3, black actually resigned in this position because he would be forced to play queen h4, and then queen f5 check would force the queen back to g5, and then pawn takes queen. So this is a good line against the Jobava London. It's true, but the Jobava London is still very much playable after the move right up here, after e6, the move knight to b5 is the right way to go. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Goodbye.